All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying with us at the Brand Innovators Marketing Leadership Summit. It's lunchtime on day 4. Some may think of this as the graveyard slot. Some may think of this as the headline act. But either way, I think we're going to have a fun conversation today. So I'm Fran, Hazeldine. Just a few intro remarks from me. Certainly excited to have the privilege of moderating this discussion about the future of content and storytelling. As the head of marketing for TV and mobile services at Samsung, my team and I are dedicated to creating extraordinary content experiences across millions of Samsung devices globally. Our goal is to inspire engagement with the streaming TV, gaming, and art content available on our platform in partnership with leading studios, content creators, and advertisers like many of you here today. Telling the story of our innovation and helping our content partners find new ways to share theirs is certainly a huge area of interest for me and for Samsung. In the next half an hour, we will explore the evolving landscape of content and storytelling, from user-generated content and the role of AI to how brands today are navigating data-driven strategies and immersive storytelling. That's certainly a lot to cover, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. We have Scott Davis, Senior Vice President of National Sales at NPR. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Fran.
And Dan Carter, Senior Vice President of Creative and Design at Freeman. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Okay, so diving in. Scott, from your perspective, how is the landscape of content and storytelling evolving, and what emerging trends are shaping the way brands and creators engage with their audiences?
Thanks, Fran. I think from our perspective, one of the key things that we try to do is speak to audiences the way they expect to be spoken to within the NPR ecosystem. So I think that's true of a lot of media brand channels, that you don't necessarily need just one piece of creative or one content execution to go across a range of platforms. And obviously that used to be the case, production limitations or what have you, that you'd produce one and then just run it everywhere. And that's clearly changed. And at NPR, it's kind of baked into our DNA that, the good news, bad news with us is nobody ever had the choice, that we had to run 15-second customized radio creative that adhered to FCC guidelines, regardless of what people wanted to do. And that frustrated marketers, for sure. But what we found out is that it works. And it especially works because that's what listeners expect. They expect a different tone of editorial presentation, and that extends then to sponsor presentation. And we've taken those guidelines from FCC and ported them over to podcasts. So it's a long answer to your question, but the point is it's just customizing any kind of brand messages to fit the space.
Makes sense. Thanks, Scott. Dan, how about for you? What are some of the trends that you've observed?
Interesting to hear you say that, Scott, because I feel like a lot of what we're responsible for at the moment is helping brands, when they want to tell stories, think first about the audience and what the audience want to hear, the format in which they want to hear it. Obviously, Freeman, we're a massive events and experiences company, but we had this thing a few years ago, this pandemic that really changed a lot about our world, and it kind of shut it down completely for a long period of time. And the reemergence after that has led us to realize audience behaviors are wildly different. So we have to kind of train a lot of the clients that had muscle memory to start their conference with a 2-hour keynote, immediately go into a full day of breakouts, and then immediately go into a networking event. We had to say to them, hang on, no. Your audience don't want to do that anymore. Your content story should not just be on screen. You should be thinking about the way people consume content, be it audio content, visual content, on screen, in person. And I think the biggest trend we're seeing is that we are helping brands recognize that this is a new landscape and that we are adjusting and they need to adjust as well, because audiences aren't going to just re-emerge the way they were in the late 2020s, or the late 2015s, I should say, late teens.
Thanks for that, Dan. So next I want to go just a little bit deeper into a couple of topics that are relevant for your individual companies. So Scott, starting with you, with the rise of user-generated content and social media, how can brands, including NPR, effectively harness these platforms for authentic storytelling and engagement?
So the user-generated content part of it, the first thing I can tell you is that we don't. But there's I think more to the story, and it gets back to what you were saying, Dan, and what we said initially, is that it depends on the space. So in social media, on social media platforms, there's an expectation and a user experience that suits user-generated content. When you go to an editorial brand like NPR, it just wouldn't work. It would be wrong, it'd be disjointed, it wouldn't fit the expectation, and that gets back to the thing that I said before, is that it's for us as a brand, it's about engage, and by extension marketers who use NPR as a brand channel, engaging with users, listeners, whatever terminology we want to use, in the way they expect to be engaged on that platform, so kind of fitting the ecosystem. So for us, the closest thing we can come to user-generated content, it means engaging with our in-house brand studio. And they produce content that is in the voice of NPR. It's definitely not editorial content. It's completely separate from editorial content and is produced within our sponsorship division. But it behaves in a lot of ways like NPR content, in that it's long-form, thoughtful, editorially sensitive and aware, and if it's done right, and I think they do it right. I'm biased, of course, but they do it right, and it allows brands to tell a longer story, kind of NPR editorial style. So these are segments that are produced 3 to 5 minutes and then excerpted into our podcast to kind of bait the hook of users. And it's keeping in mind that listeners, when they engage with NPR content, are engaging because of intellectual curiosity. So it's with that expectation that this longer form content is produced and draws people in. And so, user-generated content has its place. It's not with us, but longer form content done in the style and tone of what listeners expect, it has its place, and that's how we're approaching it.
Thanks for that, Scott. Dan, maybe for you, just thinking about your work with a B2B audience, how can businesses use physical experiences? I know that the event space is a big part of what you do, to help tell their stories and forge a deeper connection with their customers.
Yeah, I mean, something, again, Scott, that you said that I thought was interesting was that logic of like, the channel of content allows the length of the story to be told. So what we're looking at the moment is, the attention span of an audience, especially in a live environment, has evolved quite a lot recently. And as an example of that, something we're looking at with some of our clients is thinking about, okay, what you're talking about on stage should almost, like you said, be about baiting the hook. And then we can help you develop either visual or audio content that can go into the deeper dive that individual parts of that audience might have an interest in. So as an example, when Google wants to talk to an audience of brand marketers or an audience of media buyers, each of those audience members has slightly different needs. Some of them might be more interested in the ad tech. Some of them might be more interested in the user-generated content partnerships. We can talk about all of that in a 1-hour keynote, but then afterwards we can direct them to those deeper dives, podcasts being one of them that's fantastic. People are happy to sit and listen for an hour to a podcast, where in an audience-led live environment, you might be alienating 2/3 of the room by talking about something specific for a long period of time. So I think that channeling of the story into the right place is really important. And the other thing for us that we're seeing more and more of is the importance of trust in the live event space. I don't think it's surprising anyone that people are more and more skeptical of what they see online. I know we're going to talk about AI, but it predates AI's sort of recent zeitgeist emergence. But people are distrustful and more distrustful of what they see and what they hear. And I think places like NPR are still credible, and they get their reputation leads the audience to them. But we know that live events are somewhere that brands find trust from their audiences. I think we did a study with Edelman, and it was 77% of live event attendees increase the trust they have in the brand that they were at the event of. So there's no doubt that that connection is real, and I think that we are seeing from our clients that they are beginning to take money out of potentially other channels in order to put it into live, in order to grow trust and therefore brand advocacy.
You mentioned AI. Just on that subject that's been discussed from so many angles this week, as AI and automation play a larger role in content creation, what are some of the implications for you in terms of the future of human creativity and storytelling?
I'm lucky enough to lead a very large group of creative and design thinkers. And naturally, when, as has been said 1,000 times this week, AI is not new. The process of AI isn't new. It just seems to have kind of exploded into everyone's attention at AdWeek. But for us, the main benefit we're seeing right now where AI is this week is the speed at which we can iterate creatively is astonishing. So where once the traditional process of either an RFP or a creative project for a client would be, we get a brief, 2 weeks later we come back and show you the first round of work, and then you give us the feedback, and then we go away for 2 more weeks, and then we come back, and that process takes time, and in those chunks of time between when we're talking, things change on both sides that we might not be aware of. We're now saying to our clients, we need to talk to you every couple of days. We need to be able to show you what once would have taken weeks to produce can now be done in hours. So we can come back to you and show you 1,000 renders of a stage or a space. And where does the creative part of that come? We still have to be the arbiters of what we think our clients will want to see. So if we don't want to send them 1,000 images and have them pass through that, no one has time for that. We still have to be the tastemakers, and we still have to be the professionals that not only generate that imagery, but then make sure that what we're showing is realistic, can be done on the budget, can fit in the space, and frankly is the right answer. So my answer to your question is, I think the main thing at the moment for us is just the incredible speed at which we're able to do what used to take a lot longer is what's exciting me most about it.
I love that. Scott, what about for you on this topic of AI and storytelling? What does that mean to NPR?
Well, Dan, I think you touched on it with basically judgment, and that judgment isn't there with an AI tool. But I heard a story earlier this week on NPR, and they were asking a mathematician about the usage of AI, and he said, that there were concerns about, does this replace the ability of scientists? And he said, it's a little bit like when calculators were invented. And everybody was concerned that it would replace mathematicians. And he said it didn't, of course. It just made them faster. And I think that the same applies for media, for art, for content creation. And where NPR is concerned, it's not just content as a big term that everything can fit under. There's judgment involved, and that's where the journalists have to be involved. So it's a tool that can enhance speed, it can enhance access to information, but it doesn't replace the judgment of the journalist. So for us, I think that's the broader issue. We're all going to use it, there's no question, but the human involvement in all of that is I think the critical piece to keep in mind. Like, what does it do to help people do their jobs better, not necessarily what does it do to replace the humans.
So AI as a tool for efficiency, but not replacing human tastemakers, human judgment. I think that puts it well. Okay, a related topic for you, Scott, maybe. How can brands and content creators balance the need for data-driven strategies with the desire to create emotionally resonant and meaningful stories?
Well, those two things are almost inherently in conflict, right? Data and emotion. But there's space for both. I think the data drives the decisions on where you engage your audiences, because you have to find them. So you use data to find the audiences. But the emotional connection, I think, depends on, and we've talked about it a lot, Dan, already, the environment where you're trying to emotionally engage, and that's not a data play. That's how proper the content is within the space. It's something that we talk about all the time at NPR, making sure to get the messages correct for legal reasons. I can't stress that enough, but also just for tonal reasons. It's got to be the right presentation within the space to create that emotional engagement, and there's got to be some surprise in that as well. The idea that you take people to a certain place and then surprise them a little bit with additional information. That's how you create an emotional connection. But also engaging with folks within an environment where they're already emotionally connected. And I think that's where NPR can be unique. And Dan, you mentioned trust, and that's the key stock in trade for us all the time, and that's the most important thing that we can impart on brands when they're on NPR, when they're using NPR as a messaging platform. And that is that crucial part, that emotional engagement, that relationship of trust, means we have to get the message just right.
Dan, anything you'd like to add on data versus emotion in storytelling?
Yeah, I think they're maybe not necessarily directly in conflict at all times. I completely understand that can be it can be the case. I would say for us, the data informs the strategic thinking, and then the storytelling is layered on top of that. So we will use data to think about what our client wants to say. We will think about what the audience want to hear, the format in which they want to hear it, everything to the venue, the location, the logic in which we're going to use. But once those data-driven points are sort of settled, there's always time then to layer on what emotionally connects you to the actual story we're telling. So, and I think the trust point can't be overemphasized enough. We spend years helping our clients build trust, and it takes one misstep, one moment, and it can be all unraveled. So I think that data plays an essential part in helping often our strategy teams explain to clients that potentially the way they think they should tell their story may be not quite the right way of doing it. And I think without that, it's very difficult to have those conversations.
Okay, so moving along, when we think about some of the innovations that I think we've all seen from Apple, from Meta, from others in the vision space this year, the recent months, Dan, maybe starting with you, when you think about the advent of virtual reality and augmented reality, AR, how might immersive storytelling change the way that we consume and interact with content in the future? I fucking hate VR. I got to be honest. I think I did my first VR activation 13 years ago with Oculus before it had been acquired by Meta, and creatively very fun and challenging. But there's no way around the reality that about 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 people are going to get pretty nauseous from the experience, which I'm not a marketing expert, but I'm told nausea is a bad thing when it comes to brand association. So I think that the reality of virtual reality is that it will always have a place and a space in which it is essential, but I think augmented reality is fascinating. I think the reality that Apple, a notorious non-first mover in these spaces, is building that technology is a big sign to say this is going to keep going. I still think that it has to get off the head and into your hand to become at its most powerful. I think the ability to do augmented reality in some form of head-up display context without it necessarily being something you physically have on is 10 years away, but it's going to be, for us in the live space, amazingly powerful. But to me, the most important and the most phenomenal thing that's come out in the last 6 months is the Sphere in Las Vegas. I think they figured out a way, albeit at great cost, to bring to life the best things about virtual and augmented reality, that incredible ability to take you out of what you think is possible, and they merged it with the live audience experience of going to a concert or going to a movie cinema or being in a room with other people. And I know that that building cost an astonishing amount of money, but they will make their money back before they know it because of the actual quality of the experience. They're already looking for locations in London. They're looking for locations in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I think that we have brand conversations since that place opened every day with clients going, when can we book the Sphere? When can we do our next event at the Sphere? And I think they really have found the sweet spot that will keep us going until augmented reality becomes a little more user-friendly, I think. Yeah, it's a great reminder that technology is a means to an end, right? And if the end goal is immersion, as the question sort of gets at, I agree. Watching those video clips, I mean, that seems like the most damn immersive,
amazing
experience you could possibly imagine, and didn't require a headset. So.
I think my favorite thing I read about it was when they did the first night with the U2 concert, they had not anticipated that the experience was so overwhelming that people started having panic attacks, and they had to build a room quite quickly where they could bring people that were freaking out and not being able to comprehend this experience. And the room is all white, and it's filled with toys that are for 2- and 3-year-olds. And it's literally designed to de-immersify your brain from that experience so that they can bring you back in. And I just thought it was fascinating that as I made fun of, virtual reality is 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people. This is luckily 1 in 30,000 or 1 in 20,000. But it was just an interesting story that you can bring people back down from that level of overstimulation by treating them like they're 3.
I hadn't heard that. That's kind of cool. Scott, back to you. Any sort of comments on AR, VR, and the role in storytelling?
Not really, honestly. That's a little bit out of our depth. But Dan, I do want to go back to one of the things you said about data and emotional connection. I couldn't agree more. It's where art meets science, and that combination is required every single time, and not necessarily in conflict. But I think we're on the same page with that. You've got to have the science in there if you're going to be able to put the art in the right place.
Okay, I think we got just one more question, and then we'll open up for some comments and questions from the floor. What role do you think inclusivity and diversity play in the future of content creation, and how can organizations ensure that stories are reflective of a global and diverse audience? And I say this as, you know, three guys sitting on a stage, so hopefully we've got some remarks to share here, but starting with you, Scott. For NPR, the commitment is to reflect the audience that we serve, and that's an increasingly diverse audience in America and around the world. Digital content is obviously accessible wherever anybody goes. It's just increasingly important for us to reflect in terms of content, in terms of voices, in terms of editorial subject matter, the audiences who reach out to NPR for news, information, discussion, whatever the case may be. So that's core to our mission, both as a public service institution and then is what our CEO calls our North Star. So when we think about content creation, and content, I know is in some circles gotten to be a little bit of a dirty word, but I think of it more of just the editorial intent and approach. And if that mission's in place, then I think I hope we're in good shape. And that mission, again, it's just to reflect the audience that we serve. That's super important. Thanks for that. Dan, what about for you?
I apologize for being here because we were meant to have one of our executive creative directors, who is a wonderful woman that does incredible work, and she unfortunately had to pull out at the last minute. So for the first time in AdWeek history, 3 white men on stage together. I think the brands we work for, it's kind of what you said. The audience dictates this, and the audience is an incredibly diverse and inclusive place. So I don't find us, even pre-pandemic, I was still having conversations with some of the world's biggest brands and reminding them, hey, the content you've created, there are a lot of similar faces in it that are not reflective of your audience. I will say that I can't think of the last time I had that conversation with a brand. I feel like it is becoming, I'm not saying we've solved every problem, but it is becoming more of a table stakes reality to say, is this being thought through the lens of inclusivity and diversity? So more and more, I think, as those attitudes continue to change, it's on the content creators, and we are creating content on behalf of brands or with brands, to just constantly be diligent that we're remembering that reality isn't to be ignored under any circumstance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's certainly and rightly a constant topic in-house, with teams at Samsung, other in-house teams, with our agencies, which is obviously a great thing. So I think with that we can maybe open it to any questions from the audience here. Any questions for Scott or Dan about the future of content and storytelling?
I'll ask a question to Dan. In regards to creating the experience for your clients, you're telling, and we're talking about storytelling, how much are the clients focused on the live experience happening at the moment, but are you helping them continue to tell the story after the live experience, or before, during, and after the experience? Are you?
Definitely, we don't see live events occurring in a vacuum. We definitely see them as part of a communications ecosystem, I suppose. So even when we're discussing the reality of a single event, we are thinking, okay, well, how are we going to tee up this event? How are we going to start seeding the stories? Indeed, how are we going to start hearing from the audiences about how they want to consume the content? The live experience, again, it never occurs in a vacuum, so I can't stand the phrase hybrid, but the reality is that post-pandemic, all the events we do now in some way, either in real time or immediately after the event takes place, exist online in content form. Something we preach a lot is don't just set up a camera and live stream it. No one cares. You're competing with Netflix, NPR, you're competing with professional organizations that make content, so you can't expect your audience to value that over. So how do you cut something down? How do you create something bite-sized? How do you get the message small enough that they'll listen and then go and look for the additional information you're creating? And then after the event, how do you foster discussion? How do you take what that audience learned and assimilated with, and then how does that continue to live after the event? So to answer your question, we utterly believe in that live events sitting in the middle of a much longer period of time and a longer spectrum of interaction.
Okay, any other questions?
One at a time, guys. Joke always works.
If not, I think we can wrap. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for having us. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.